So thank you very much for joining me here for this conversation, bit of an experiment, and I appreciate you being open to it. And just before we go too far into the experiment, I'm going to ask you to describe yourself in whatever way you would like to present yourself to the world here.
Sure. I am a career sustainability consultant. And as you know, I've spent a number of years working closely with you on projects in the corporate sustainability / ESG space, largely in the strategy and communications realm, but always with a lot of connection to the other, components of that world, by which I mean the more technical, environmental aspects, and all the other ways you can slice that space, especially over the 15 to 20 years I've been doing it. The evolution that the field's gone through, obviously have been on the front lines of that. Nowadays, I'm largely a freelance consultant, again, still in the strategy and communications world, working with primarily US companies at this point, but a lot of international companies over the course of my career.
Awesome, thanks. And in the spirit of disclosure, as you've already mentioned, we had a chance to work together, and I feel like in some ways we are, we've been operating in sort of parallel worlds, collaborating with a number of the same companies and teams. So it's really great to have you here and get your opinion and insights on this, and to have a chance to collaborate once more. So huge thank you. Also in the spirit of transparency, wondering if you currently have any commercial connection to Google, because we're going to be talking about them as a company. So just want to check if there's anything we should know.
I pay them for services, but other than that, no. Yeah,
you and me both. Cool. Okay, good to know. So we're also going to do this materiality or reality-based materiality assessment on Google, which means we're going to look at the company, its business models, what it does in the world in relation to the future we want. And to ground that conversation a bit, I would love to hear about the future you want. There's lots of language that gets thrown around there: sustainability, regeneration, flourishing future, and of course we're speaking English. There's lots of other ways we could express this in different cultures, etc. But for this conversation, I'd love to hear in your words, what's the future you want? What does it look like?
Well, it's all of those things, for sure. I'm not sure that I have more to add or a unique spin on it necessarily, but I certainly think of it as, humanity continuing to survive and prosper and grow, not physically necessarily, but emotionally, spiritually, and otherwise socially. And I think that obviously requires living in harmony with the biosphere and the resources available to us. I'm not sure there's more to say than that.
Cool. Yeah. I like that.
Peace,
feature.
Prosperity, fun.
Yep.
All of these things are important.
Yep.
Self-realization.
Cat food.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thanks. So as mentioned, we're here to talk about Google in that future. Mm-hmm. And you know more about assessing materiality than most people on this planet. So you know that typically we look at some of the positive and negatives in terms of the issues. But in this case, I'd really like to zoom in on the business model itself. So what the company does for a living. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in relation to that future you just described, what you think of as the positive impacts or the sort of positive activities that Google, we're talking about how it currently functions, not what you wish it would do or what you recommend, how it currently contributes to that future that you just described, if it does at all?
Right. Well, I certainly think it, anchors or centers around the accessibility of information and the power and value of information in that future, in the present as well. But obviously, I think having access to information, the ability to communicate with others, those are all really important, in a variety of ways, for the reasons in terms of the values that I expressed earlier, like certainly fun. It's fun to have access to content and information and stories, and to know what's happening in the world. But then at the other end of the spectrum, it's essential to democracy and to, sort of equity of opportunity and access to knowledge about what's really going on, and being able to leverage that to make choices in your own life and in your community. So that's sort of vague, but that's what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see how that enables almost the infrastructure of that positive world you described, that future. Are there other ways Google's contributing? And I'm particularly curious your thoughts, knowing that you've worked with a lot of technology companies. You've got a lot more perspective, I think, than I do, and than most people on, let's say, tech as a sector.
Mhm.
So when you sort of widen the lens of what Google does all day, are there other ways you see it contributing to that future?
Yeah, I mean, you could go deep on that question. But I have observed the company for a really long time. And I was really excited in their earlier years about that sense of mission around making information accessible and meaningful, at a moment where, with or without Google, we were becoming more, awash in information. That's been a trend line we've been on for some time. Now, you could argue Google has been an author of that reality, but again, if you buy that was happening anyway, that they inserted themselves into that as, one, a very consumer-oriented company. It's not an enterprise-oriented company like Microsoft or some of the IBM, some of the forebears in the technology space, where, technology is complicated, it's expensive, we'll handle it. You're just a user. Like, Google made the user central in a way that I think was really important and valuable, and it made an individual user able to access and marshal and organize information in a way that I don't think was possible before some of its tools existed. And I think that's really valuable. And I think that continuing to have that approach is really valuable. So for what that's worth.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. It's interesting too. I'm realizing literally in the last 24 hours, I just upgraded the way I use Google Suite and paid for more storage. And I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff that 2 years ago, I think, I don't think I would have done that. But just recently, I'm like, they actually really are making it way easier for me to do a bunch of stuff. And as anybody clicking around in this project would notice, I'm using Google to assess Google.
Right.
So you're kind of getting at the meta thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, to that point, I'm being very high level, but of course this plays out in a bunch of the verticals within their business. So, a lot of us encountered them originally through search, and then it was like Gmail, and then they bought YouTube, and, it kept on going. And while I am, aware of and critical of Google as part of this sort of constellation of companies that have, you know, had a lot of negative impact through the way information is used, making, you know, the user the product is the critique oftentimes. I also am really conscious of how it's made things possible that weren't possible historically. So I'm thinking of content creators on YouTube, not necessarily like Flat Earth or, you know, Proud Boys type of content producers, but literally like I do a daily yoga practice that is on YouTube, and it's changed my life. And it was not accessible to me in that form as cheaply and as easily as it is now without YouTube. And so there are very, you know, specific small stories, human stories about what these tools enable that are incredible. Another story is, and I'd be surprised if one of your other interviewees hasn't mentioned this, but Google has a long-running ad campaign where they focus in on some of these stories. I wasn't even thinking about that when I cited that. Maybe that was subliminal, but they have one about that I just saw while I was on vacation last week a couple of times. And it's about the story of a family and how they connect through technology and how meaningful it is to them, especially during the pandemic. And, you know, tech companies have been doing these ads for a really long time.
Sure, yeah.
And yet I almost cried watching this ad
Wow.
because I think these people are real, or at least it's very well produced. Like, it's just a very meaningful story that resonates with like the emotional experience of living through a pandemic where you're alienated from your family members and what that means. And like, I think for all of its flaws, there's a kernel there that is incredibly important and shouldn't be lost in thinking about what technology or what the sort of product of any company potentially adds to our lives.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just curious, when you say you watched it, what channel were you watching that ad on?
Oh, I think we were watching NCAA basketball.
So you're watching TV
like a
and it was an
broadcast.
ad for Google?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Although we were watching broadcast television through a streaming platform. So it's all.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So that's kind of surfing through some of the really positive impacts that it does indeed sound to me like that contributes to the future you were describing. What if you go towards the negative and you consider, based on Google's activities, business model, what it does for living, and how it might be undermining that future? What comes to mind for you there?
Well, I think it's rooted in centralization and sort of monopoly power of a single company that controls so much of our information space and does it ultimately for profit. You know, I don't know enough about how it would truly work, but I am sympathetic to the view that as the internet has matured and become more essential to our daily lives, that we should think of it partly as a utility, and that it should potentially be, you know, regulated, not in the same way, but with some of the same principles in mind, the reasons why we regulate power and water and things like that as essential utilities. And I think in many ways, people's sort of fondness for Google or their dependence on Google has clouded our ability as a society to reckon with that power and check it, you know, to some degree, or manage it effectively. And so, and I think Google has used that to its advantage. Like a lot of big tech companies have. They're sort of like, oh, you know, it's a nice information economy you've got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. So I think that we've seen the effects of that. I think they are a better corporate citizen than some of their peers. And so, you know, you could level stronger criticism towards others potentially. But I also recognize that that's a public debate that we don't always have all the information we need to be able to parse. And so some of what we reflect is narratives that are in the media or in our sort of cultural conversation that aren't always based in reality. But I think the sort of time frame and evidence has accumulated to tell us that there are issues with this sort of concentration of power. I remember the point like 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago when suddenly Google spent like several $100 million in the space of a year or two to actually set up a lobbying operation in DC. And what a sort of like, oh, right, they're like a grown-up company now, and like there's value at stake, and you know, this is what their stakeholders expect them to do because it's a modest investment to protect this enormous wealth generating machine that they've created. So I think that there are questions about how that concentration of power manifests in our society, and what the impacts of it are. And I think you could get into more detail around, you know, questions around content moderation and, you know, free speech and the role of tech companies in spreading misinformation and so forth, and the effects that those things have on our society. I think that there's a whole set of questions about, as I mentioned before, like the user as the product and the way in which information is manipulated to maximize or meet the goals and the ends of Google, you know, or any other intermediary like it, and its clients, which are advertisers and people who are paying to leverage the information that they can wield. So, you know, the notion of, yeah, okay, I get a lot of things out of that, and it's cheap because it's actually supported by ad dollars, which then draws me and everybody I know onto the same platform, so we get network benefits. That's all really, you know, meaningful, but at the same time, there's a cost to that. And I do think the cost of that is that monopoly power, you know, the potential that they are manipulating the system in ways that don't necessarily, you know, correspond to my own ends, and instead correspond to their own. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I'm going to just probe a little deeper into this one. When you think about that future where, you know, the biosphere is healthy and we're thriving, prospering, living in a very harmonious relationship with that biosphere, what about that concern you just described potentially undermines our ability to do that? And I may be asking you to state the obvious, but I don't want to assume I know why you think that might be a problem.
I mean, I guess I was talking more about the sort of social cohesion and, you know, the sort of ability of society to understand and respond to challenges and opportunities that it faces, or that we face as individuals as well, by the way. But I am thinking in a very communitarian aspect, like, how does society function? Can we understand and solve our problems? Can we, you know, improve our condition? I don't mean material condition necessarily, but again, emotional, spiritual, otherwise, on an ongoing basis? Or are we, you know, the Matrix example, right, of the people in vats who have been completely exploited to serve somebody else's needs? You know, that's not self-determination.
Right.
So I was speaking about the social. Now, it sounded to me like you were asking me to think about the biosphere aspect and maybe connect to environment,
Yeah,
or
or
maybe I've
the
already answered your question.
yeah, you have to a degree, but maybe I'll lead the witness a little further and just see, what you think, because I feel like when you describe society solving its problems, um, it's my humble opinion that one of our problems is we're totally disconnected from the biosphere, right? So we
Yeah,
don't see ourselves as one among many.
yeah,
We don't necessarily see that we are entirely dependent on a healthy ecosystem,
yeah,
and that manifests in lots of ways, from disease states to failing environmental factors like rainfall cycles, etc. So
yeah.
um, I'm curious if you see that centralization of power and that we're kind of just plugged into the vats
Yeah.
as problematic in that wider context. And I may be putting words in your mouth or asking you to
No, I mean, it triggers a
describe
thought for
something.
me, which may or may not be appropriate to the question you're asking. But um, in talking about the benefits of what Google provides, um, I was thinking a little bit about the um, digitization has often been, um, and the ability to communicate over the internet, especially with video and sort of more human connection, has been touted as a way to decrease our environmental impact of commerce, or of the things we do, what we used to drive to see each other, or we fly, or whatever, right? Like taking meetings online, having these interactions. That's always been interesting, and it has seemed valuable. But I think we had this really interesting experience in the pandemic where suddenly that was required. We had the tools. It's hard to imagine how we would have, like, it just would have been a different experience if we didn't have these tools that we suddenly had when the pandemic hit. And at the same time, my experience of it was, and maybe you had this too, like 3-4 months into it, where I was doing a bunch of Zoom calls with like family to stay connected, I reached a point where I was like, I don't want to be on Zoom. I just don't want to do it anymore. Like, I would rather go for a walk outside. I would rather, even if I have to stand across the street, I would rather stand on the street and talk to a stranger across the street than talk to my own family members who I miss dearly,
Yeah.
because it's human and it's in the world.
Yeah.
And so at the same time that these technologies have made us sort of say, wait, could I do without traveling across vast
Mhm.
distances, or hosting a big physical event that has lots of physical impacts, even if everybody comes from down the block? Um, and the sort of answer is yes, I can. And also, I don't think I even want to do that event, because now that I've sort of unplugged from that question, I've opened myself up to this other set of questions, which is, what's right here around me? Who
Mhm.
is right here around me? Why does that matter? And so that kind of relocalization and connection to what's real and in front of you is really important. And I really wrestle with that, because I don't live in a cosmopolitan city anymore. I have in the past, and I have enjoyed what that means in terms of diversity of thought and
Mhm.
identity and activities, and just the amount of energy and cross pollination that's occurring in that environment. What that means for, okay, I'm local, now I can go do a whole bunch of stuff. I
Mhm.
live sort of off the beaten path now. And so it's that much more important to me to connect to the broader world and to stay connected to the broader world, because the things that people care about locally, don't entirely do it for me. And
Hmm.
so I want it both ways. Like, I want to be able to connect across these distances. I want to be able to ingest and parse information about what's going on in the broader world. Um, but at the same time, I don't think that's an end in itself, or it's not enough on its own. And so I think that there's value in connecting locally. And I think part of the challenge for a company like Google is, how do you honor that? How do
Mhm.
you um, how do you tell people I mean, maybe the Patagonia example always comes to mind, right? Where it's like, hey, listen, we made these products because we liked going outside and we knew that people needed equipment to go outside. REI does this too, following in Patagonia's footsteps to some degree. But the point isn't the equipment, it's
Mm.
outside.
Yeah, right.
And so, you know,
Right.
part of the problem for tech companies is that they become sort of self-reinforcing about like, look what you can do with the tech. And now to make more use of it, you actually need to just use it more, buy more of it, you know, spend more time on here. And that's true, especially in social media, right? Like everything's driven by engagement. And, you know, what would the business model be if it was measured in terms of how little time I spend on it because it's met my needs and I've gone on to do something that's more fundamentally valuable, self-actualizing, or at the very least just helps me live a more balanced life so I can be a consumer for a very long time.
Oh my gosh. Hold that thought on that question because it might come back in just a moment. But I love that. I feel like there's a whole separate like trail we could go down, but I'm going to push us forward. And in this instance, I'm going to ask you to do one of the things that I have poo-pooed in traditional materiality, but I'm nonetheless bringing into this reality-based approach, which is to help me with a ranking. And in particular, in a 2x2 matrix, I'm going to ask you to say where you would place the company of Google. I'm going to share my screen. Tell me if you see, what do you see on the screen here?
I see a 2x2 matrix.
Except it's, you know what, it's not fully framing it. Let me try that again. There we go. And so you can see that here I have the company just drifting off to the side, not yet ranked in any way. Vertical axis represents the health of the ecosystem, where above the line is contributing to the health of the ecosystem up to a +5. Below the line is undermining the health of that ecosystem to -5. And likewise, on the horizontal axis, we have the societal health. Anything below the line, the company is undermining. Anything above the line, the company is contributing. That is holding that future in mind. So to what degree would you say, based on the company's current business model and how you understand that they function today, to what degree are they contributing to or undermining that future? And with the two dimensions of social and environmental. And I would ask you, where should I place this bubble?
Right in the middle, obviously.
For real? Or where would you put it?
Well, I mean, it's my starting point because for all the reasons we just outlined, like I see massive positive benefits and massive negative, you know, impacts and potential impacts. So then the question becomes, well, okay, what sort of thought process would I use to maybe push it in one direction or the other from that starting point?
Yep.
And I would tend to put them both closer to the negative side of things at this point. And I think that that's, in a way, that's what I'm bringing to bear on that is a projection of the trend line that we're on, which is that I don't see evidence that the business model fundamentally will support more positive and less negative over time. I think in some respects, we're trapped in more negative because that's what the machine relies on to generate profit. So again, as I talked about, you know, the manipulation of information and targeting and so forth in order to meet other people's ends is a counterweight to the positive benefits that the technology can have.
Yeah. Have I got them in the right place here? Would you say it's more negative than I've got it more socially or environmentally, like I've sort of got them equidistant here? Is there anything you'd emphasize in one direction or another or change?
I'd probably go more negative on societal health than on ecosystem health.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Am
I
I
do
negative
think
enough here?
that, well, I do think that technology has negative environmental impact. I do think it's valid to ask, which we usually ask is, okay, but tech relative to other sectors or
Mm.
the alternative activities that people might engage in if they weren't, communicating over the internet,
Mm-hmm.
comes into play. So I think there's quite a bit of efficiency to what they do as well. Um,
Mm.
and I do believe that Google has pushed harder than some others to green its footprint to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the bigger impact is on the societal side. And um, I think that proponents, and even me to some extent would argue, okay, but the ability to make profit, the ability to sell advertising, to support these platforms makes all the benefits that we've talked about possible. And
Mm.
that a similar set of benefits wouldn't be available under a different business model. Um, which I think is a fair question, or at least a fair debate position to take in this. So it's sort of hard to turn that into numbers, obviously.
Yeah, there's deep hypocrisy that I'm exhibiting here by putting up a 2x2 matrix. Just before we move off of this screen share, is knowing this is an impossibly hypocritical question.
Yeah.
Would you move this bubble from where I've got it right now? Or is it satisfactorily representative of what you feel you said?
I think it's satisfactory.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for humoring that. You know better than anybody the speciousness of what just happened there.
Yeah.
I'm going to push us forward into a couple more kind of imaginative questions and then bring us to a close here. So the first one is, this just in. You are in charge of everything. Nothing is in the way. So you've got absolute power. And with that, I would ask you, what changes would you make to Google, to the company?
Well, if I'm in charge of everything and there's no limits, I'm not sure we need companies in that world.
Nice.
But I will humor you in any case. So I think that first step would be to make it possible for people to opt into degrees of their business model. Which would be to say, if I'm a new Google user, and I think they do this to some degree. I mean, this has been the trend as tech companies have tried to figure out how to make their complex technical reality sort of more transparent and more accessible to people so that they understand what they're getting themselves into.
Mm-hmm.
But I think sometimes they sort of warm over the description of one end of the spectrum so that people say, yeah, whatever, that's easier, I'll just do that.
Yeah.
And instead, like, really present to me like, hey, you could pay. And if you pay, then that means, we're not going to use your information in all these ways. You're not going to see ads. We're not even going to use algorithms on you to try to, steer you towards things that maybe make us or others make more money. You're just going to get the information raw, right? Or, that's that. And I could see that actually opening up a space in which the tools they're building and the purpose of those tools starts to change, because now they need tools that serve my ends in that space, as opposed to in a best case balance those ends with the other stakeholders' ends. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you could tell me, hey, look, if you agree to this, this, and this, and we sell all this stuff. Here's what you get in return. Just make it easier for me to do the cost benefit analysis to some degree, and take it from there. That's one idea. I think I find, and I know you and I both read Jaron Lanier's work around the idea of compensating users for the information that they contribute in our user content driven internet system. I think that's really cool and interesting. And, you know, if I were in charge of everything and I thought, what should Google do? Again, I might at least launch that as an experiment in their, you know, in their ecosystem and say, okay, here's a new tranche. Here's where it works this way, and see if that's workable. And again, to try to optimize it to be useful to users, and to more fairly share the spoils of that system. That makes sense. Yeah, I think fundamentally, like going back to my earlier critique, like it's not just monopoly power, it's literally information asymmetry, right?
Yeah.
The advertiser has more information than I do about my choices and what is likely to govern my choices. And so I would love a system in which I had all that information too. And like my own data that was accessible to me in a way that let me see patterns so that I could make more informed and empowered choices as a consumer. I've ranted about this before, but I've thought for years that credit card companies should make SKU level data available to me, because they have it. They know everything I bought, when I bought it, what I bought it with, you know, what time of day it was, where I was at, what activity I was likely about to participate in when I was buying, you know, a 6-pack of beer and a sandwich, and a life preserver, right? Like they know I'm going to the beach for the day. So I would love as a consumer to be able to see that and say, wow, I'm buying too many cookies, you know, and clearly it's when I go at this time of day, and maybe I could hack that to some degree. Like that would be really interesting. And I you know, it'd be interesting to give people the opportunity to pay for that level of service, right? Make it something that benefits me, not somebody else.
There's a lot I want to dig into there. I'm also just going to take the pin out of your comment earlier of, imagine if the business model was incentivizing you to not spend more time using the technology because you got what you needed in less time. You know, that I feel like that lives in this story you're telling of, you know, when you run the world, how technology companies work. I love it. Is there more you want to say on that one, or can I take you into the next?
Well, I was going to acknowledge and appreciate that, you know, Apple has made some moves in recent years that I think reflect some of this thinking. And there's still problems with Apple for sure, but you know, it'll tell you now what your screen time usage looks like, and the rate, and how that's trending, and what categories of activities you're doing on your phone or your laptop that, you know, will tell you something about how you're spending your time. I mean, I have an Apple Watch, and there's fitness feedback, right? It's like, hey, whoa, you're pretty sedentary today. You sure you want to be doing that? Like there are tools like that, and even Google participates to some degree in those things. So that's, you know, it's not to say that it's not happening, but my point is maybe more about what would it look like to push fully in that direction,
right? Or for that to even be sort of baked into the business model versus a nice kind of tweak over here, like kind of greening of operations style stuff. Cool. Okay, I'm going to push this forward in the interest of time, but these are the places I'd love to hover. So unfortunately, you're no longer in charge of the world and everything in it, so we have to let that go. But happily,
Whiplash.
What's that? Whiplash?
Whiplash.
Well, this just in, so swallow your
Okay.
beverage there. You have a direct line with the CEO, with Sundar. Am I saying his name right? Sundar Pichai.
Yeah.
And he takes your calls. He's like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you called. But he's super busy. He wants to know what you think, but he's only got 30 seconds. What do you say?
Say I need a retainer so that we can talk on an ongoing basis. I can call you as new ideas occur to me. I mean, it's an interesting reframe because part of what we do as consultants is that we do have to put ourselves in the shoes of the people we are consulting to and the constraints that they face. And I recognize that most of what I would like to see as a citizen or a human individual would probably cause most CEOs to lose their jobs if they propose them. So then the question becomes, okay, well, how do we move in that direction in a way that doesn't, that to some degree preserves the reason why companies exist, the system that makes them work, but even more fundamentally, doesn't foreclose on the opportunity to change them, right? If the change is too radical or, too sudden, then obviously we would just fire that person and go back to the way we were doing things before. So the question becomes, how do you actually achieve a change? I think that's true of like the low carbon transition as well. Like we all know we need to get there. We've just known for a really long time that it could unfold in ways that not only cause a lot of suffering in the short term, but actually ruin our opportunity to complete the transition in the long term. So anyway, that's a long way of stalling.
It's a little more than 30 seconds, but
I know. I think I would maybe go back to the idea of allowing people to pay what it would cost to use their services without advertising. Allow me to take this unseen third party out of the equation and show me, the costs and the benefits of that. But don't make the choice for me, I guess. And they could argue that, well, yeah, you're free to go to somebody else. You don't have to use ours. You like ours because we do it this way and it's better.
Yeah.
But again, it's my premise is like level with me as a consumer and allow me to navigate these choices with more information and with more choices. Now, a lot of people might choose to just stick with the system as it is. And again, you hear that argument because people don't take the time to read the license agreements. And if they truly cared, they would recognize the risks and then they would say, oh, I don't want to expose myself to those risks. But really, again, the way it's set up is everybody's doing it. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you're going to take a day off to read this license agreement? Do you have a lawyer on staff? Like, what are you really going to do? And it's just like, come on, jump on. Nobody's really getting hurt. And if they are, it's just because, it's their fault or whatever. Like, allow me to choose the alternative.
Yeah.
I think this is playing out to some degree with GDPR and what's happening with all the websites now asking you and giving you choices with respect to cookies. And we are all on a daily basis experiencing all of the different ways to go about setting up those interfaces to allow you to choose your preferences. I don't know if you just say accept all cookies on all of the pop-ups, but
I usually do.
If you click into choose,
Yeah.
there's something like 3 or 4 or maybe more different paradigms for how those play out. So some will say, turn everything off, just give me what's essential. And that's an easy click. And if I'm a cynic and I'm skeptical and I don't want to be monitored, it's just like, yes, just do the essentials, which by law they're allowed to say are essential. And then others will say, well, actually, there's like 17 categories of information collection that we do and different purposes that we put it to, and you can click each one on and off. And even on those lists, sometimes it looks like when it's clicked on, it's clicked off. So you'll look at it and say, oh, it's off, I accept. And then in fact, you've just opted in, right? So there's a lot of manipulation going on, even in that, which to some degree is legally allowed, because the only reason this exists is because it was mandated, but it clearly wasn't mandated strictly enough to say there's a common experience where everybody understands what they're choosing. So, I would love for Google to just say, listen, even if we think the way we've set things up is superior, we're going to make it really, really clear, painfully clear to people what's involved in that. And we're going to allow people to opt out of it without sort of shaming them in like forcing them to be excluded from the communities that we've created online. Just allow me to pay. Allow me to be, who I want to be on the internet.
Yeah. Wow. It would just be an entirely different world.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I hope he does take your call and put you on retainer. Lots more we could talk about, but that's the last question I had for you. Other than, is there anything I didn't ask you about that you want to make sure we put on the table here in this conversation?
Not that won't launch, infinite additional conversations.
Cool. Well, we can always come back for another round, but thank you very much. I really appreciate you, of all people, with your experience in materiality and in the tech sector and in collaborating with me and my zany ideas. I am super grateful that you were here. And with that, I'll bring us to a close.
All right.